So it's my RDO. I'm in the bush just out of Bendigo. I'm in some ironbark forest that's pretty typical, a lot of the bushland around Bendigo. If you looked at this location on Google Maps, you wouldn't really see anything. There's a couple of roads that go through here that seem to be quite old and don't really seem to go anywhere. But if you were to talk to some of the older people around Kangaroo Flat in particular, and some of the older ones with grey hair, maybe the really old ones, they might know this place by an older name, because there was a little community here called Break a Day. And if you look around in the bush, you can see there's some areas where there's been levelling. There's some tracks, as I said, but there's not much that remains. But what we do have is this open cut mine that runs through here. The Hyundai is more modern. If you're missing a white Hyundai Excel, let me know and I'll send you a GPS coordinate. If you go over here, the other thing we have is the remains of a pretty substantial mine through here in the valley. So I'll wander over, but this was the Break a Day mine. And this was the Break a Day community. Now the records don't have a whole lot of information here because I don't think there was actually a whole lot going on apart from the mine. It was here in the early days of the gold rush in the 1850s and 60s, and then it largely petered out, although there were still people living here into the 20th century. So, down here is the main shaft. It's capped. Then we're doing a poppet head here, and you can see from the tailings that this is actually something pretty substantial. And it goes on. If I walk up here, these piles are actually huge. And you can see some dams and the remains of some other little bits of earthworks here. So fast forward to 1867 in July, the Break a Day Mining Company is not doing so well. The half-yearly meeting reports a significant loss for the last 6 months of over 900 pounds. The shaft has reached a depth of 275 feet and 6 inches, which they were counting in there, but they were not recovering enough gold. The decision was made now to stop down commercial operations and put the mine out to tender. And that's really the last we hear of the mine, so presumably it shut down not too long after this point. One of the things that's cool about sites like this is you wander around and you find lumps of quartz sometimes, and like it could have just come from over there, but I do wonder if this was pulled out from deep in the bottom of the mine shaft somewhere with enormous effort, and obviously wasn't worth breaking up for gold. So kind of cool. Like to speculate. So this isn't about the Break a Day mine. This story actually takes place in the area, but I can't show you photos and I can't show you where it is because it's completely lost to time. The account I'm going to describe is made up from a variety of different newspaper clippings
that sometimes contradict each other. So it's a little bit put together. I'm going to show you some pictures and some sketches from around that time just to help sort of make sense of what the place was like and what the scenery is like. These ones are from the State Library of Victoria by an artist, S.T. Gill, who travelled around Bendigo in the area at the time. And there's some pretty cool sketches there. And you can see a lot of these dwellings are very temporary and very small, very basic, and that's why basically there's very little remains of them. Somewhere in Sunrise Gully to the Kangaroo Flat side of Break of Day was a public house called the White Swan. It sounds like it was a reasonably substantial facility. It had a bar, it had a lounge, which was called a parlour. It seemed to have a residence at the back. The story set in Easter of 1873 on Easter Sunday. It sounds like things weren't going particularly well for the pub. The area was in decline anyway. The pub had recently lost its licence to sell alcohol after a string of drunken incidents. It was unclear whether it was still trading or not, and some of the papers sort of hinted that it might have been, and some of the others listed as a grocery store. Charles and Sarah Smith run the White Swan. Charles is at the back and he hears the door opening on Sunday at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Someone wanders into the bar. He wanders out to see who it is, and there's a man there who he knows as Peter Morris. Now, Peter Morris, whose real name was Pierre Boreau, was actually a Frenchman from Brittany in France originally. He'd obviously taken an anglicised name. Peter Morris was trouble. He was one of the primary reasons the pub had lost its licence. He'd had multiple altercations. He'd assaulted both him and Sarah not that many months earlier. He asked Peter what he wants, and he said, "Give me a glass of brandy." And in Charles's account, "I do not sell brandy now." Peter replied, "What's the matter with you? You used to sell brandy." Charles says, "I have no licence, and besides, it's Sunday. I do not sell it." Smith gently led him outside by the elbow through the parlour, and there Peter stopped, with his back to the frame, refused to go out. Charles gently led him out by the door and shut and locked the door and said, "I will have no noise or row on a Sunday." Shut and locked the door behind him. The lower the panel of the door is immediately kicked in. Alarmed, Charles Smith proceeds out through another door to fetch the police. He passes his wife, Sarah, on the way. "That Frenchman's kicked our door in. I'm going to go and get the police."
So today, Kangaroo Flat is almost up to the edge of what we considered Break of Day back then. But back then, there was only a few blocks of Kangaroo Flat, so it was a full 2 miles from here to the centre of town and the police station there. Smith made his way into town. He's only a few hundred yards down the road when he hears a gunshot and a scream from back at the White Swan. He stops. He thinks in his own account, do I go back? Do I keep going? He goes on for help. At the end of the day, he was probably unarmed. Pretty tough decision, but what would you do? He keeps going. So he gets a little further down the road. He comes to a hut of a friend called Briggs. He goes and explains to Briggs what's happened. "I think the Frenchman has shot my wife." He goes, "I'm going to go into town. I'm going to get help. Can you go back and check on her?" Briggs has thought about this probably for half a nanosecond, decided that the power of good intentions probably wasn't a reasonable match for an armed and homicidal Frenchman. He doesn't go to the hotel either. So this rather sad looking block here was the site of the police reserve and the police station at the time. I know what you're thinking. There was an 1800s building here that was recently burnt down, but that actually wasn't the one. That was Smith came to. It was the predecessor here. But this whole block right back here was the police reserve and included paddocks for the horses because they had mounted police here. When Smith arrived here at the police reserve, Mounted Constable Lee had just finished saddling his horse to go out on police business. Smith comes up to him and says, "I think that bastard Frenchman has just shot my wife." Now, Lee knew the Smiths. He knew Peter Morris. And he'd been involved heavily in other earlier altercations at the hotel. He headed straight for the White Swan, leaving Smith behind.
Lee was first to arrive at the White Swan. He entered via the parlour, described the room as being in a state of disarray. There was a large blood stain on the floor in the middle of the room. He carefully searched the premise room by room and found nothing till nearly at the back door, where Sarah Smith's body was laying face down and full of blood again. Her left hand had nearly been blasted away, and evidently she had a gunshot wound to the chest because her frock was covered in blood. She was still warm, but clearly dead. The blood had not yet clotted on the floor. There was no sign of Peter Morris. Smith and Briggs were now outside. Constable Lee came out and informed him of what he had found. He recovered his horse and rode directly to Peter Morris's hut. It was empty, but on the ground outside he found a small double-barreled pistol. It had evidence of having recently been fired. Unable to find anything else, Lee returned to the White Swan. There was obviously a small crowd there. He was told by someone that Peter had a friend just near the hotel in Kangaroo Flat. He figured he might have gone there, so he headed that way into town to see what he could find.
So Constable Lee's heading into town and he sees Peter Morris just on the edge of town, just outside Briggs's hotel. This isn't actually Briggs's hotel, but this is one from the same era, so it may have been similar. So coming into Kangaroo Flat, Constable Lee spots Peter. He's just about at the door of Briggs's hotel. This is not actually Briggs's hotel, but this is one from about the same era in the next valley. Peter makes a desperate bid for the door, but word's already spread, and the people inside have seen him coming. The door's locked. Presumably the time Briggs's hotel's door wasn't stolen, so they probably could lock it. Any case, Lee's down off his horse. There's a struggle and he's arrested. Peter sees the gun in Lee's belt and says, "Ah, you found my pistol. I shot her with it." Conveniently, he's confessed to the crime and owning the firearm. But, that's Lee's account. Anyway. He's then marched up the road to the police barracks and put in custody.
The Frenchman was brought to the lockup at Kangaroo Flat and secured. Mrs. Smith's body was brought into Briggs' hotel. Actually, it was a common practice back then, pending an examination. Another officer was summoned from Bendigo, and they brought Pierre into Bendigo Police Barracks via a cab. Along the route, he repeatedly made multiple violent attempts to escape, understanding probably fully what his fate would be if he was convicted. At one point, he remarked that he only intended to use one barrel on Mrs. Smith, but both had gone off together. Justice moved quickly in this era. A coronial inquest was held the very next day at the Briggs' hotel, with a defiant Peter there in shackles in front of the regional coroner. Dr. Ozell had examined the body, and he reported that Mrs. Smith had most likely been shot from behind, and the cause of death was a laceration to the heart caused by a bullet. You do have to wonder, though, with a blood stain in one place and the body in another place and a shattered hand, whether she'd actually had her hands up in front of her when she'd initially been shot. More witnesses came forward. And it seems in the time between the crime and his arrest, Peter had managed to drink more and actually talk to two people independently about the crime and what he'd done. Now this was really harming his chances of not being convicted. Minor, James Julian, who resided within 100 metres of Peter, said Peter had come in to say goodbye. "You'll see me no more," apparently greatly in liquor. "I've killed Mrs. Smith," he said. He said it was all nonsense, and Peter produced his pistol. "This is what I've done it with." He had shot her when he refused him credit, he'd explained. James caught hold of the pistol and took it from him. Another witness, John Strawn, who was also a miner, came across the prisoner and he'd asked what was the matter. He said he'd shot Mrs. Smith with a pistol and she was dead. Peter had then put £2 in John's hand, said to bury him. Said out cryptically later that he would want to go and kiss Mrs. Smith for the last time, and he wanted John to go with him. The witness went with the prisoner back to the house. There at the back door lay Mrs. Smith's body. Peter went down and kissed her in the face, and at this point John had had enough, and he left the prisoner there feeling quite sick. He turned away for home. The inquiry had a jury, and at the end of the evidence given, they consulted for only 5 minutes and returned a verdict of willful murder against the prisoner, Pierre Barou, Peter Morris. They added, "We desire to express our high appreciation of the promptness and intelligence of Constable Lee, as evidenced by the early arrest of the prisoner and the preparation of this case and the investigation. And we respectfully request that our expression of our opinion be forwarded to the proper quarter." Peter, who had been rebellious at the start, was now quiet and subdued. He knew his fate.
On the 28th of April, Peter faced the Sandhurst Supreme Court in this building behind me. To everyone's surprise, he's pleaded guilty to murder. The court judge seemed so surprised he actually adjourned the case for another day to make sure that he'd saw proper legal advice. So they reconvened on the next day, and Peter's solicitor informed him that he was not going to change his mind. And so the case was basically closed at that point with a guilty plea. So on the 21st of May, Peter Morris was executed here at Castlemaine Jail. Not sure why he wasn't executed at Bendigo, Sandhurst Jail. It was built at the time. In keeping with colonial custom, his body would have been buried here within the prison in an unmarked grave. Even in death, the executed weren't allowed to return to normal society, which, particularly for Catholics and some other cultural groups, was actually a pretty big deal.
Sarah Smith was buried at the Kangaroo Flat Cemetery the same day as the inquest, as was the necessity of that era. And then they all disappear into history. There's no reference to the White Swan. There's no reference to Briggs Hotels. Charles, Briggs, all the other characters are lost to time.
So I'm just off the road in Sunrise Gully, and the pub was meant to be in Sunrise Gully. And if you come into the bush up here and have a look, there's some interesting stuff up here. Bricks, and we've got mortar. We've got some old sheets of tin. I've got the remains of some rammed earth here. Now, it's not a big space, and this could be a whole lot of things, but I wonder if this is part of a rammed earth hut or an old residence. If you look around the corner, two sides of it, no idea what it was. Could have been a whole lot of different things, but maybe this was one of the huts in the story. Probably someone's residence. It strikes you how small this probably was. Just a temporary house while they scratched around the bush and tried to make some money out of what was left of the gold here. So if you find yourself on a road in the Goldfields that doesn't really go anywhere anymore, the remains of old huts and ruins and scratchings of gold diggings, and you see a pile of rocks that's sort of suggestive that it was once a fireplace in a hut or a building, or maybe even a long forgotten public house. Spare a thought for the people whose lives were etched out here, and what for them was the edge of the world. They were often difficult, and sometimes they're a bit too short. Thank you.